Thankful that God makes salvation. He makes having spiritual life in Him simple and uncomplicated. It's just as simple as looking to Jesus Christ and leaning on Him and looking to Him by faith. And I want to say tonight, I'm grateful for you, your commitment to the Lord and one another, your desire to be faithful to what gatherings we provide. I know that life can wear on you, and distance and travel and time, and we lead American busy lives, and sometimes those lives are too busy, I feel. But I do appreciate in the midst of that your desire to gather with God's people and fellowship and be in the Word of God and be in prayer together. And God bless you for that. God bless you for that. But we're back at it tonight with part 4 of this study on the rest of the story. And we're learning from this true story that Moses wrote for the children of Israel in the first 5 books of their Bible, the Old Testament, and the first 5 books of our Bible, of course. Who's afraid that going from Exodus through Deuteronomy tonight might be a time-consuming endeavor? You could be honest. Oh, yeah. Well, I hope you're pleasantly surprised by our approach tonight. Really just want to simply give you some big picture things to help us just see the forest, all right? Colin was up in the air today. Beautiful day to fly, and I'm sure seeing the forest is pretty nice, seeing the different things like that. And that's what we want to do. We want to kind of get a bird's eye view of things and see the forest from the trees. I still want to give this to you in somewhat of a story form, if I can possibly, and that's how all this is written. It's historical narrative. And certainly these books of the Bible are called the Law of Moses, yet the law was given as a written history or within the written history of Israel. Okay? So let me give you the cliff notes here, okay, for these books. They record the nation's beginnings, as we saw this morning. They record the nation's departure from slavery in Egypt, where we pick up tonight. The nation's God-given commands as His people with whom He made a covenant. The nation's wanderings through the wilderness and their subsequent wanderings away from God. The nation's loss of a generation of unbelieving men and women who would not obey God. And then the nation's new generation and the reminder of who they were, how they had been in the past, and what their God expected, but also predicted of them as they prepared to head into the land He promised them. That is Genesis through Deuteronomy in a pistachio shell. So let's crack open that shell and chew on the pistachio for a bit tonight. Does that sound good to you? If you get something stuck in your teeth, well, that's your fault. I'm just kidding. Anyways, so we were introduced to the story of the world this morning in the account of God creating the universe. And God made this earth for man to have rule over. And man blew it out of disobedience to God. He would not listen to God. He listened to his wife. And he blew it. And things got worse and worse for man in spite of God's grace toward him. And eventually God called one man, Abraham, and He made promises to Abraham and his descendants to bless them, and through them bless all the families of the earth. And even though the story of the Old Testament narrows to the nation of Israel here, it is still a story that involves the whole world. So briefly, to remind you of God's promises to Abraham, He said something akin to this, nearly verbatim from Genesis 17. I'm making a covenant with you. I will multiply you. Many nations and kings will come out of you. My covenant's going to be with you and your offspring, your seed, forever and ever and ever, to be your God and the God of your descendants. And I will give you and I will give them this land, all the land of Canaan, with eternal property rights. I will be their God. And God expected Abraham and his descendants to order their lives according to His covenant with them. Thus He gave them the covenant of circumcision, and thus He gave them all the laws to be His covenant people. We'll see some of that tonight. But as we read Genesis, we find that Abraham and his descendants had their ups and downs. Don't we have our ups and downs? And God, being the faithful God He is, He kept His word in spite of them. He even kept his promises when the nation reached its lowest point up to that time, slavery in Egypt. Now, in Exodus chapter 1, Moses introduces the reader to the terrible bondage that Israel found herself in for hundreds of years. In chapter 2, he mentions his own beginnings, his own upbringing, and even his failures. And by the end of chapter 2, notice God's perspective of the nation in bondage. Look at verse 23. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his, what? His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. So when God heard their cry, he remembered what he had promised them. He remembered his covenant to them, okay? The next 13 chapters chronicles God's work. His work to send Moses to Egypt and see to it that his people, Israel, were set free from their slavery. God showed Pharaoh in Egypt powerfully, I'm God. You're not. And your gods are not God. God showed his people, Israel, that he had not forgotten them in their long affliction and in their hardship. God, by the hands and by the words of Moses, he did mighty miracles, signs and wonders that rescued his covenant people from bondage. Now, I want you to notice God's game plan in all of this. Remember the promises. I will multiply you, Abraham. I will bless you. I will give you a seed innumerable. And I will give you the land of Canaan forever, okay? Notice God's game plan in the Exodus, in delivering his people from bondage. Look at chapter 3 and verse 6. He let Moses in on it from the start. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, I want to pause briefly there. As I studied and prepared this, this morning when we hit, I think it was Genesis 17, I made mention that Abram fell on his face. You remember that? Moses, when the bush was burning, but it wasn't consumed here, I believe he might have fallen on his face. I'm not sure. God told him to take your shoes off. For the place where you stand is holy ground. And he was afraid here to look upon God. And what I find as I read Genesis through Deuteronomy is a God to be feared. It's a holy God, a faithful God. And our attitude, if we really had an experience, I guess, if I could say that way, with God, it would be one that would certainly humble us. It would certainly change us. Some things to think about as believers in this God. Okay, look at verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Beautiful. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the who? The Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, unto the land he had promised them long ago. God said, I'm coming down to visit, and I'm bringing them out, and I'm taking them there, and I'm fulfilling my promise to them. Who thinks that's just a random detail? Or is that pretty significant? No, it is. God is on his own agenda, is he not? Moses didn't have to get on board with this. I'm thankful he did. You don't have to get on board with God's agenda, but I know you'll be thankful if you do. His agenda is a good one, thank God. Now this nation, once redeemed by their God, they were on their way to their land, the land he promised. And that journey took place over the course of Exodus, Numbers, I skipped Leviticus. That's what Miss Stephanie wants to do in her Bible reading. How you doing? You doing okay? She finished! Amen! Give a round of applause. Okay. Oh no, whatever. All right, we celebrate the big ones, all right? All right, so Leviticus, it all records this journey, and even Deuteronomy, to the promised lands. And I want to just give you kind of a snapshot of significant things that happened on the way. You can read these books and find them, but these are some big picture things that happened. One, God faithfully provided for their needs: food, water, clothing. Their clothes did not wear out. Okay, He faithfully provided for their needs. Second significant thing, God gave them His law, His commands, so that they could know how they ought to be as His people. He was setting them free out of bondage. They had been in a land that was ran by a pharaoh and people who worship false gods for hundreds of years. Who thinks they could have gotten away from understanding who their God was? Who thinks that's a possibility? Absolutely a possibility. And so He gave them these things so they could know their God. Go to chapter 19. Look how quickly we are working through this. Chapter 19. Look at verse 3 of chapter 19. Moses went up unto God. Chapter 19, verse 3. The Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto who? Myself. It was always about their relationship with God. That kind of reminds me of what God said to Abram, I will be their God. I brought you unto myself. Verse 5, Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. And these are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. So, if they would obey His voice and keep His covenant, they would be a kingdom of priests. They'd be a nation with direct access to the only living and true God, unlike any other nation. And this would surely bless them, wouldn't it? And it would surely bless the nations. And then Exodus chapters 20 through 31 record the 10 commandments. They record additional commandments God gave them. They record instructions for the tabernacle, which was the tent in which God would dwell with His people. Okay? Leviticus would expand and expound on the commandments of God for His people to be a holy people and what they should do since they were sinful. Because if God was going to dwell with them as a sinful people, and they had all these expectations to be holy in every area of their life, for I am holy, God said, they weren't going to measure up to God's standard. They needed something to deal with their sin, to cover their sin. And so God introduced them to a system of sacrifices that were to be carried out by the Levites in the tabernacle, so that their sin, their uncleanness, their unholiness would be covered, and they could have God's presence among them. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Third significant happening en route to Canaan. They proved themselves to be unfaithful. As God was giving Moses his law the first time, they were down the mountain worshiping false gods. A cow and playing playful music and taking their clothes off. And as they traveled through the wilderness, they often grumbled against God, against Moses, their God-appointed leader. They consistently lapsed into unbelief, fornication, rebellion, mutiny, and just all-around wickedness. Are you understanding the picture of these people in the law of Moses and the history of their beginnings? And God did not overlook their sin time and time again. God punished the wrongdoers, the people who broke His laws. In spite of His promises to them, in spite of His faithfulness to them, in spite of His power to move them forward to the promised land that He was giving them freely, they tripped over their unbelief. They wouldn't stop complaining. They wouldn't stop rebelling. They wouldn't stop digging in their heels and looking back, thinking they had things better off in Egypt. And then an entire generation of Israelites were killed by God in the wilderness because they would not obey God and move into the promised land. Surely, as the writer of the letter to the Hebrews said, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Ask the men who played Russian roulette with their lives as they defied their God. So to be sure of some things, God did not stop with his plan or his people. Some of his people were rebels, stiff-necked to him. But not all of his people were rebels. As you get to Deuteronomy, God would move forward with his plan and his people with the next generation. And even there were a few from the rebellious generation who didn't go along with the crowd, like Caleb and Joshua. But you get to Deuteronomy, and Moses was giving the new generation of Israelites a history lesson. He emphasized the faithfulness of God. He was honest about the rebellion of Israel. By referencing their past, Moses called them to obey God into the future. Now go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Look at verse 1. Deuteronomy chapter 4. So you get a feel of where we are. This is the new generation. They're about to go into the promised land. The wilderness wanderings are over. And they have all this history behind them of ups and downs. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. Now therefore, hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live, and go in and possess the what? The land which the Lord God of your fathers giveth you. Ye shall not add unto the words which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did because of Baal Peor. For all the men that followed Baal Peor, the Lord thy God hath destroyed them from among you. But ye that did cleave unto the Lord your God are alive, every one of you this day. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should do so in the what? The land, whither ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them. For this is your wisdom, the commands of God for them to live out in the land. This is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes. The nations shall hear these things and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them as the Lord our God is, and all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, unless they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life, but teach them thy sons and thy sons' sons. And as you follow what Moses says here, again and again, he warned them to take heed to their lives, that they be obedient to God's commands. He warned them to take heed to themselves, that they be not forgetful of God's covenant. And this was serious. Look at verse 24. For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God. Moses warned that if they or their descendants did their own things, things would not go well for them. Look at verse 25. When thou shalt beget children and children's children, and ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and make a graven image, or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord thy God, to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that ye shall soon utterly perish from off the what? The land, whereunto ye go over Jordan to possess it. Ye shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed. And the Lord, watch this is significant. He shall scatter you among the nations, and ye shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you. And there ye shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. If they provoke the Lord, they would perish from off the land, and God would scatter them all over the earth. But then, notice, if they repented, look at verse 29. But if from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him, if thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul. When thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shalt be obedient unto his voice, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God. And all God's people said, Amen. If you do that, he will not forsake thee, neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he sware unto them. And so Moses was saying, if you, from where you are scattered because of your rebellion, turn to God, he will be merciful to you. And so as you follow what Moses says all through Deuteronomy, he echoed these things throughout his last public, hey, let's go, people. He echoed these things. He passionately reminded them of God's law. He urgently warned them of forgetting God. He anticipated that disobedience to God would result in a total destruction of their lives in the land. Go on over to chapter 28. Chapter 28. And look at verse 1. He said, And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. And then Moses commenced to list the blessings of God in the land that would come on them if they obeyed God. And you can check them out at a time of your choosing. But notice verse 9, the Lord shall establish thee an holy people unto himself, as he has sworn unto thee. He promised again and again, I will be your God. And if they would be faithful to him, he would establish them as a holy people unto him, as he promised, if they keep, verse 9, the commandments of the Lord thy God and walk in his ways. And watch what would happen. Watch what the nation's response would be to them. Verse 10, all people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of thee. Does it sound like God desired to bless them and through them bless the nations? Okay? Are we tracking the story here? But also notice they had a choice. Look at verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And the curses that would come upon these blessed people if they wouldn't listen to or obey God were mind-boggling. And what would you expect if a nation so blessed decided to turn their back on the one who blessed them? If they turned their backs on God, they could expect, in short, they could expect their lives to be cursed in every way and in everything they tried to do in life. God would smite them with diseases and famines. God would let them be conquered by their enemies. God would bring them into captivity like they were in Egypt. He would bring them into captivity all over again to a nation that didn't believe in him at all. And everything he blessed them with, he would take away from them and let someone else have. Now look closely. Look at verse 62. And he said this is important. Ye shall be left few in number, whereas ye were as the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou wouldest not obey the voice of the Lord thy God. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good, and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you, and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked from off the land, whither thou goest to possess it. And watch this, the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have none assurance of thy life. And as we unpack the history through the Old Testament, that's exactly what we're going to find out. And many of the lamenting prophecies, that's the feel you get. We need to remember, now you need to realize this, go to chapter 30. We need to recognize that God expected all of these things to come to pass, both blessing and curse, before they ever happened. Moses said, here's the blessing. Here's the curse. Obey, you'll be blessed. Were there times in the future, Bible student, that Israel obeyed God and they were faithful and there was blessing? Yes. Were there times when they forsook God and there was a curse? Yes. God expected both to happen. Look at verse 1 of chapter 30. It shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee. So when these things have happened, you've hit the high, you've hit the low because of your rejection of me. And thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations. So you're remembering these things. You've been scattered. You're not even in the land anymore. Your lives have been decimated. When you remember these things among all the nations, whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee, and shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath what? Scattered thee. So here's a blessing. If you disobey, here's a curse. You're going to be scattered. But after that, if you recall these things to mind and turn back to the Lord, what did God say he would do with his people? He would gather them back to the land. Look at verse 4. If any of thine be driven out into the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee, and the Lord thy God will bring thee into the what? The land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. This is significant. Look at this, verse 6. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine what? Heart. And the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. God fully expected all these things to happen. They would choose the curses of God over the blessings of God. They would follow the path of hard knocks, away from the blessings of their faithful God, all the way into bondage under other nations. Yet God promised he would one day gather them from wherever he scattered them all over the world, and he would bring them back to the land he promised, and he would give them a new heart to love and obey him. Now let me ask you something. When Jesus came, did he offer them a new heart? Yes. But by and large, did Israel embrace what he offered to them? No. Now there's coming a day, Paul would say, all Israel shall be saved. You see where some of this is going? Okay? A foundation is being laid here, and we'll begin next Sunday to see how exactly all this would play out in their history as a nation. But before we go tonight, would you consider this? Just let the sobriety of these things weigh on your heart. I know we're saved by the grace of God, the grace of Jesus, the mercy and the love of God, and praise God for that. But his love would be insignificant if it wasn't for his holiness, his wrath, his justice against sin. Should God's people abandon God? You're here tonight, God's rescued you from the slavery of sin. You say, well, I don't feel very rescued. I'm just as much a slave to my sin. I kind of like it. Well, then we need to go and revisit that with you. But if you're saved, if you've been born again, God has rescued you from slavery of sin. And God has brought you out of bondage, and he has made you a new creature, given you a new heart, and he dwells within you by his Spirit. God's not in a location like a tent. He's living in you, and he's with us, and he's here with us as we as a people gather together. Whenever we gather together here or at some other location, the people of God, here we are gathered together. God's in our midst, and we have the privilege of having his word. We have the privilege of having the law of love found in the New Testament, which we can live now because we're new in Him. We have the gospel of Jesus Christ, the forgiveness of sins, the hope of heaven. This is our wisdom in the world, isn't it? Should any of us walk away from God? Should any of us walk away from Christ or His church? The New Testament would ask something like this. If the people of God in the Old Testament were so greatly judged by God for their rebellion, how much more will we of the new covenant be punished if we walk away from God? And that's not to say that God's going to condemn us to hell. He saved us from hell. But it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That was written to believers in Jesus Christ. And if we walk away from Christ and His people, His church, do we think God won't notice? If we have foolishly and proudly thought, I am saved by Jesus, I'm not under the law, I can do what I want. May God strike our hearts with fear. And may we humble ourselves before the God who is a consuming fire. As the writer of Hebrews said, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear.